Hello everyone. So it's Monday the 20th of October 2025 today. Tomorrow is the 21st of October, which will be the anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And also at the end of this month, Langton Miniatures, who produced all of these model ships you can see here, these are the French and Spanish over here. Langton Miniatures will be closing down, and I only found that out recently, but I've left it too late now to order any more models from them. Not that I really need to do so, because I have got quite a large selection of unpainted models still in my lead mountain, and I think the last time I ever assembled one of these and painted them was probably about 10 years ago. Some of these models go back to my purchases. I can remember the year, it was 1992. I've had them, I've had them a long time. I've got quite a large stash of unpainted models, and haven't really, pursued my interest in Age of Sail wargaming in quite a long time. So you might ask, well, why does it really bother me that it's sad to see Langton go, but why do I feel the the effect of it quite so deeply? And I think the answer really is that I've got a sort of sense of shock, because to my mind, these 1/1200th models are the top. They're the pinnacle of the wargaming choice out there. If you want to battle war games in the Age of Sail, the Langton to me are really the go-to range. And I'm not surprised. I'm not I'm not. It's no surprise that Rod and Carol Langton, were going to retire at some stage. We all grow old and want to retire, and they are well past the age of retirement now. So it's no surprise in that respect. But to me, the real surprise is that no one seems to have come forward to take on the mantle, to take over the range and continue to supply these models to the wargaming community. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, really. So apologies if you've clicked on this video because of the thumbnail showing you all these models, thinking that you're going to get a video on a war game that I'm going to play. I am going to play a game with these models probably tomorrow, and I'll put that up on YouTube as a back rep. But this is going to be a very general discussion. It might go on and be quite rambly about change in general, but in focusing mainly on change in the wargaming hobby and this particular genre of wargaming. What mechanics are there behind change? So it's going to be very, very general. So why is it? What's going on? Why is it that no one has seized the opportunity to to take over the marketing rights of this range. I'm aging myself now. I'll soon be 72, and I do feel, you know, as though I'm aging, but I don't feel as though I'm particularly aged, if that makes sense. I'm aware of things changing. I'm aware of the world changing around me. Um, and the best way I can describe my own feeling really about my age is that as I've grown older, I've seemed to know a lot less. I find it harder to recall, from the point of view of facts and figures and dates and so on, and specifications of, in this case, of naval vessels and battles and so on. It's harder to retain that, and I frequently have to, thank heavens for Google and the existence of Google, as it's very easy just to refresh your memory using Google nowadays. But at the same, so I know a lot. I know a lot less, but at the same time, I feel like I understand a lot more, and I kind of understand what's going on with change. One of the particular influences on my attitude to change is my kind of investigations into complexity theory, which I came across many years ago now. But this book in particular, Robert Axelrod's The Complexity of Cooperation, subtitle Agent-Based Models of Competition and Collaboration, which is in the Princeton Studies in Complexity series. This book in particular is, I would recommend this reading as a way, as a sort of novel approach. Really, well, it's no longer novel. It was written quite a long time ago. I try to think now how far back. Oh, it's irrelevant anyway. I won't dither about trying to find that. Yeah, it sort of opened my eyes really. My whole investigations into complexity theory and reading books like this, it opened my eyes to why things don't necessarily change in the way you think they ought to, in the way you think they inevitably will. The change doesn't necessarily lead to progress. It doesn't necessarily lead to improvement. It just leads to something different. And in the case, if I go back to these models, in the case of the disappearance of this range of models, if I were much younger and had an interest in wargaming and decided that I wanted to get into Age of Sail wargaming now, what would I do? I would obviously search the internet, and I would come across Warlord Games and the what do they call it? Black Sails. Is it Black Sails or Black Seas? I always get it muddled with the TV series about the sort of age of pirates, which I think was called Black Sails. So yeah, the Warlord game must be called Black Seas, and they do an accompanying range of models, and those models are splendid, but they're all much larger than these ships. They're all 1/700th scale, whereas these that you're looking at now are 1/1200th scale. So much bigger ships, beautiful, and I would go down that route because it's that they dominate the market now. Even you know, regardless of the fact that Langton won't be around, they've dominated the market for quite a long time, and not only that, but they have also stimulated interest in this particular genre of wargaming and stimulated people who wouldn't necessarily have even contemplated fighting battles in the Age of Sail to buy their rules, to buy their models, and many people would be completely oblivious of this option of a smaller scale and other rule sets and so on. On the subject of rule sets, I'm intending to use another extinct set of rules. I was thinking about using the Avalon Hill Wooden Ships and Iron Men rules, which I would have played on a hexed mat. So basically that is transferring a board game across to the tabletop. Read through those rules again, but I decided to go with this set of rules called Trafalgar, which was brought out by Warhammer Historical. Now this gets me onto a kind of different approach to this whole thing about change, because Warhammer Historical, part of the sort of Games Workshop empire, and they had quite a large library really of historical games, lots of ancient battles. They did a Western game, Legends of the West. They did a pirate game, which I think was called Legends of the High Seas. Great deal. And suddenly one day, they from the marketing strategy, which directions Games Workshop wanted to go, they just suddenly decided to axe the whole of their Warhammer Historical activity. So you can't get this set of rules any longer. I mean, the last time I looked, you could buy up old copies of it for about 75-80 quid on eBay. So it's got a sort of scarcity value now. But again, that was another change that took place, and it happened very quickly. It was very kind of volatility is very important in this whole aspect of how changes occur and what changes actually take place, and so this takes me back to this Axelrod thing, that it's all to do with the sort of complexity theory is all to do really with analysing systems. So a system can be anything. It could be a society, it could be a hobby, it could be a town, or it could be a business, anything at all. But within that structure, within that system, there will be laws. There'll be underlying laws that all the component parts of that system are obeying. They're not. It's not necessarily written laws. They are just background habits and norms that people or things follow. So, for instance, to try and keep it on this theme of naval wargaming, most wargamers, myself included, have this sort of real butterfly mentality that they will flip from one subject to another and think, oh, that would make a really good war game, or that I'm interested in that period in history, or that new game that's come out, something like that, and they'll give it a they'll give it a try. So there's a kind of constant background. It's not a law, but it's a sort of habit that we all have. That if something comes out that is shiny and bright and attractive, it draws people to it. You know, in a way that is greater. It has a greater pull than you might necessarily otherwise think it would do, simply because there is an appetite for it at a particular time. So at this moment in time, we are, the appetite is for Black Seas. It's not certainly not for Rod Langton's set of rules, which were called Signal for Close Action, I think, if I remember correctly. Very detailed, ponderous set of rules. Certainly doesn't produce fast play, but it does capture a lot of the nuances of naval wargaming, in terms of sail settings and attitudes to the wind and tides and currents, and even sort of minor differences in a ship's armament, all those kind of things. Trafalgar, that I showed you a moment ago, is much more simpler. Never played Black Seas, but I would imagine that that Warlord games do have a similar kind of approach to lots of things, their rule writing, their marketing, their different strategies for bringing out new games and so on. So they are a sort of shared a lot of old staff as well with Games Workshop. So I should imagine that Black Sails is a very similar set of rules in a way to Trafalgar. But my point is that we will be drawn to those kind of temptations, those kind of appetizing products and so on, and it tends to sort of push what might be defined, what I certainly would define as a superior range into the background, to the point where they will eventually go extinct. One of the classic examples of that, Axelrod in this book talks a lot about what he describes as industry standards conforming. So why do products, rival products, why does one succeed and the other not? How does an industry or a marketplace conform around one particular standard? So we're not talking about standard as a regulation. It's not a regulatory definition of the word standard. It's the accepted. What we mean here is the sort of accepted type that you'll go for. So the classic one would have been the long time in the past now, but in the early days of videotape recording, you had two different systems. You had Betamax and you had VHS. VHS came out on top, but that was almost by chance. It was by a better marketing strategy and a faster kind of assimilation throughout the industry than Betamax. But a great many people thought Betamax the better quality the higher standard in a different way than VHS. But it was VHS that came out on top. Betamax just disappeared, so Betamax recorders ceased to exist, and we went on to VHS, and then, so I won't go into the whole rigmarole, but VHS finally expired as DVDs came out, and now DVDs are fast becoming a thing of the past. I am going to talk a little bit about DVDs a little bit later, maybe very soon actually. I might transfer the camera around and show you some of my DVD collection with respect to naval history. Might do that in just a moment, but that's really what's going on. I haven't described that very well, but basically a system will organize itself, so you get what's known as self-organizing criticality. So you'll get to a point where the system has reached a juncture where any further change will cause a potentially major change in the whole system. So one tiny little thing might alter, and if there is a great deal of interconnection between all the component parts of that system, then it will become quite volatile, and a small alteration in one part will then have a major knock-on effect that seems way out of proportion to the original stimulus, that will change that system forever. And here we are at the end of October 2025, and naval wargaming now will never be the same, because old sort of fogies like me will slowly die out. Even these models are collecting dust. They're quite embarrassing to look at if you look at them in close up. They've got, dust caught up in all the rigging and look very scruffy and untidy and so on. And, it's just going to die off. It's just going to die away. And talking of death and so on, inevitable end of people's lives, I was very sad to notice a couple of weeks ago the passing of Diane Keaton, who was one of my favourite actresses of the 1970s and 80s. The sort of to me, I know it wasn't to a lot of older people, but to me the 70s were kind of like the heyday of cinema. Again, it gets me back onto this whole thing about DVD, so let me just point my camera at my DVD shelves for a moment. Yeah, I'm beginning to ramble and wander a little bit now, so we will talk about Diane Keaton in a moment, but I forgot to sort of finish that point about the disappearance of Langton miniatures, is that anyone who is thinking about taking over Langton miniatures is going to look at the marketplace and look and assess that the effort that they will have to put into casting the figure, the models, and running a business, is that going to pay off when you have that dominance of Warlord Games there competing with you? And that, I'm sure, that is what is putting people off taking Langton over. So even though it is superior in the same way that maybe even Betamax was superior to VHS, It's just going to disappear. It's going to die because of that. The Warlord games. Good as their models are, I'm not denying that they are good models. It's just they have that dominance, they have that power and profile, and they just take all the oxygen out of the system. So there's no room for any other competitor to breathe other than a sort of more like a dilettante approach, that it will be taken over by someone who just does it as a hobby rather than as a business. And maybe an enthusiast will buy it up, but it's unlikely. Yeah, so to get back to Diane Keaton, there is never going to be actors of her caliber coming up in the future. And why do I say that? It's because cinema has changed over the years so much. I mean, I won't show you them all, but this is just one shelf of. Try and do a quick count. I've got sort of 15 shelves at least like this dotted around. And this particular shelf includes, I try my best to sort of sort them out by themes or whatever. And from here to here are all things that are related to the sea, related to naval history, all stories. Somewhat. Oh no, one of them is a documentary. Got an Australian documentary there on battleships, but mainly fictional. But this is where a lot of wargamers get their inspiration from. It's from media, it's from film and reading books and so on. This is what might, prompt them into getting into naval wargaming. I mean, there's a lot more than just Age of Sail here. But cinema is changing so much, and it's been, there's been this sort of corrosive effect of digital technology, of streaming services. I was only talking to this, about this with a friend of mine last week about how, we just don't go to the cinema anymore. My memory of Diane Keaton is seeing her on the big screen in the 1970s and 80s. I used to go probably, once a week, once a week or 2 weeks to the cinema to see something. Films just don't succeed in that way anymore. They just, there aren't the there isn't the motivation to make films to draw people into the cinema now. It's all transferred to the small screen, the iPad and the television, and linear television is disappearing as well. It's all going down the route of streaming services like Netflix, and the classic age of cinema is past us now. So yes, there will be actors of Diane Keaton's talent out there, but half the time, they will only be on show to a much smaller segment of the population as a whole. There isn't that habit any longer of people visiting the cinema, having a night out in the cinema, and that's what I mean about laws in systems, that there isn't that tradition any longer, that custom of a night out in the cinema. I mean, people obviously still go to the cinema, but not to the same degree. People get their entertainment in a much more immediate way and with a much more in a much more selective way. They can choose what they want to watch, but it's taken away a lot of the sort of money stream from the cinema, but also from the TV companies. So let me sort of give you some examples here of what I'm trying to talk about. You've got things like the Hornblower, the ITV series back from the 1990s. Here now, it's a sort of big budget undertaking to make a series like Hornblower. There just isn't the finance out there any longer to do something like this, because investors will know that they aren't going to get the return on their money. So it's very unusual for to be able to come across this kind of thing on television anymore. The BBC is really under pressure now. The quality of their drama is appalling nowadays compared to what it was even 20 years ago. It's just not there because they haven't got the money. They rely on lots of private, firms to tender their productions to them. And we're never going to see something like Hornblower again. It's a past age. By the way, this film, Captain Horatio Hornblower, starring Gregory Peck, it's a very good way of concluding the Hornblower series, because the Hornblower series, unlike the Sharp novels, never covered the entirety of C.S. Forester's books on Hornblower. And in fact, I think that probably goes back to this whole budgetary thing, that they cut. There was a potential there for them to make further episodes, and they just stopped. And that was there was probably a financial consideration there. But the Hornblower TV series ends at a very kind of morbid point where he's got married to someone who he just feels an obligation to marry, rather than there being any deep kind of emotional attachment, to her. So she ends up as a sort of burden to him. And the last episode of the Hornblower TV series ends with him going to sea and leaving, his wife at home. And the Captain Horatio Hornblower film is actually based on some of the later books, and C.S. Forester actually had a part as well in transferring his writing to the screen. So in this, it will be giving you spoilers, but you've had plenty of time to read the books by now, if you wanted to. Yeah. So Hornblower falls in love with Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington's sister, who he is giving sort of passage to on his vessel from Central America back to England, back to safety in England. And during the voyage, they fall in love with one another. But he is obviously married, and she is engaged to another naval officer. So you think the story is going to end like that, but in fact, interspersed with all the action, adventure, and sea battles that are going on, He comes back to England at the end of the film, and when he originally gets back to England, he discovers that his wife has died in childbirth, and that doesn't solve the other issue, though, that his new lover has to get married to this. She's obliged to marry this naval officer that she's engaged to, but he is killed in battle. So at the end of the film, the two of them finally get together. So there's a nice sort of happy ending. So if you do watch the Hornblower TV series, I can recommend you then, watching the film, and as a pair, it is a complete sort of story with a nice happy ending. Yeah, what else was I going to say? If you look at these two films of the Battle of Midway, the original film of that title was with Charlton Heston, Henry Fonda. At the time, they did pull out all the stops to make it a real cinema-going spectacle. So it was filmed with a technique known as sense surround, which was basically just two screens. If you can imagine a curved screen, so it was kind of split in the middle, and then it would wrap around the audience, so that you had things going on, not quite in your peripheral vision, but you had things going on to the side that did make it feel more immersive. There were things, if you looked to one side of the screen or the other, there were other little bits of the action going on. So there was lots to look at, and also it made it feel as though you were kind of entering the screen. So that was, when would that have been? 1970s. So this is back, to that heyday period when I used to go and see films in the cinema. I did go and see Midway in the cinema. Then you had more recently, I think this was just before COVID, you had this film here, which has been on television quite a lot now, who was in this? Woody Harrelson was Nimitz, I think. Other stars who, this is my point really, that I know of them, I recognise them, but they're never going to be able to get that status and that profile that Charlton Heston had back in the heyday of cinema. So that's my point, really, in a way. But this film, I did go to the cinema to see, and it employed a similar strategy to the original Midway, in that it pulled out all the stops to use all the current technology and gadgetry and so on, to make it worth you going to the cinema to see it, rather than sitting at home watching it on your iPad. And the things they used was all the new, 4D technology. So you wore 3D glasses, but you also, I saw it in sort of 4D. So I was sat in a chair that shook and moved, and you had noises around your ears and sensations in your seat and in your back coming through the chair, and even smells, and also kind of sprays of water and moisture that would be sort of blown into your face. So it was really quite remarkable. I really enjoyed it. Sort of being you're put in for instance, in the cockpit of a dive bomber. So you feel as though you're, diving forward, because the seats tilt and so on, and give you a sense of the pull of gravity. and the plane shaking, so your chair is rattling as you're kind of in the dive bomber, descending on a Japanese aircraft carrier. Really brilliant. But cinema is being obliged to go down that road. It's being obliged to have more special effects. This has been going on for quite a long time now. More special effects, more explosions, more spectacle, less emphasis on language and plot, because it's a global market now that they're having to exploit in order to maintain their profitability. So a lot of films are going to countries that non-English speaking countries. So you're having to put either put subtitles on the screen, or concentrate on films where there's a lot more action and a lot less speech. So acting becomes less of a priority. So that the old days of really talented cinema performances, is disappearing because there's no longer a need for it. I'll just go very quickly through all these films that I've got then. So Sailor of the King, I think that was a C.S. Forrester story originally. Very good, very good. I won't go into the plots too much, but it's basically a heroic performance of a single sailor who foils a German frigate, I think it is, or a destroyer, has to set into this island, and he's a prisoner on the ship, and he manages to escape, and then takes pot shots at the crew trying to repair the vessel, and delays its sailing for long enough that the Royal Navy catch up on it and sink it. Yangtze incident is about the amethyst and the it being trapped in the was it either late 40s or the early 50s, trapped by the communist Chinese, and they have to make a break, down the Yangtze River and out to sea. 3 classic World War II naval battles. So you've got the Battle of the River Plate, In Which We Serve, and We Dive at Dawn. I'm going to tell you what my favourite naval film is at the end of all this, but the Battle of the River Plate is certainly up there. Again, they can't make films like the Battle of the River Plate anymore, because in the 50s they had access to lots of Royal Navy ships that were still in service or about to be decommissioned, and the film industry was given access to those ships to film a lot of these epics. Sink the Bismarck with Kenneth More. Similar thing there, that there are a lot of genuine naval vessels featured in it. Very good film. The Caine Mutiny. Right, now this takes me on to another theme, something that that we won't necessarily ever see again, is that the US Navy is very unsympathetic to naval themed films if they have any mention of mutinies and so on. So they're very keen on this film to point out that the Caine Mutiny is a fictional episode, And the US Navy is very keen for the cinema industry to emphasize that there has never actually been a mutiny on board a US Navy vessel. Now, that is a very sensitive point, because if we go on to this next DVD here, the battleship Potemkin, probably this is the Eisenstein, 1924 was it? I think, can't remember. There were lots of mutinies in the Russian Navy. Part of that was that they were politically sort of driven. That there was a very deliberate strategy with the Bolsheviks prior to the Russian Revolution of infiltrating the Russian Navy. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on in this very long video. But after the revolution, even though the Russian sailors had been very sympathetic to the Bolsheviks and fought on land during the Russian Civil War for the Bolsheviks, the communist regime rapidly realized that the Navy was a potential weakness in their regime, because they were so powerful. They did have such a positive influence on the course of the Russian Revolution that the same thing might happen again, that there was a vulnerability. Any regime has a vulnerability to its navy mutinying. That's true of the British Navy, even though there have been mutinies in the British Navy. The Royal Navy is very sensitive to it as well. And it's particularly the case in Britain because, we are an island nation and rely on our Navy for a lot of our security. It's one of the reasons why so much of the Secret Service has a naval background. But anyway, mutinies as a whole, you have to be very careful how you portray them on film. And the US films will not have any. They won't countenance any cooperation with the film industry if it features any kind of narrative in which any part of the plot deals with a mutiny in the American Navy. And so let's jump forward a little bit. You have this film here, Crimson Tide, which is an absolutely superb plot, has a fantastic convoluted plot where Denzel Washington's character leads a mutiny against Gene Hackman, and you're really torn as a viewer between knowing who is in the right. Really, Gene Hackman is legally has the sort of the advantage in his argument, but Denzel Washington has the moral high ground. But my point is that the US Navy did not cooperate at all with the making of this film, and there is a fantastic shot of a nuclear submarine heading out to sea, but the producers and director had to hire a helicopter and just pursue a submarine out to sea before it's submerged and film the submarine without the Navy's permission, because it's not against the law to film these vessels. But the US Navy would not supply any footage or supply access to their submarines in the making of that film. Where we got to? So I've spoken about Midway already. I've got this in my library, Pearl Harbor, starring Ben Affleck, just as a, for the sake of completion, really. I didn't like the film at all. I thought it was dreadful, over-dramatised, very superficial. Got 3 films here now, set at sea, all Japanese films, all starring Toshiro Mifune. There's one on Pearl Harbor and Midway. There's the Battle of the Sea of Japan, which was the Battle of Tsushima. And there's Attack, I think that translates as Attack Squadron. Oh, and there are 4 in here, actually. There's another one on the theme of Admiral Yamamoto. They're all very good films. In fact, they influenced the making, the techniques they used influenced the making of that first Midway film, and starred some of the same actors, and I think featured some of the same models of the ships, but not difficult to watch because some of them don't even have subtitles. So if you don't speak Japanese, I know a little Japanese, but not enough to be able to follow too much of the conversation. You have to just know what's going on, really, and enjoy the spectacle. Das Boot, I'm sure you're all familiar with, story of a German U-boat. I would again put up there in my top 5. Difficult to kind of list them all, but still not number 1. What's going to be number 1, you're wondering? So I've talked about Crimson Tide. Hunt for Red October, another one of my favourites. Potentially, it's kind of based almost on it's a fictitious story, but there were incidents going on around the time. What was the guy who wrote it? I can't remember his name. Tom Clancy. Around the time that Tom Clancy wrote The Hunt for Red October, there were certain things happening under the seas that he wasn't, I don't think he was really aware of, but it's just coincidence, because the stories only came out later. But the technology to interconnect, have these sort of locks that would allow you to, for submarines to link up and transfer crew and so on, all that kind of technology was there at the time of The Hunt for Red October. So Tom Clancy had this knack of being able to write convincing and dramatic stories that were feasible as well as entertaining. Already spoken about the Hornblowers. Right, okay, this then is my number 1 favourite, I would say, Master and Commander, starring Russell Crowe. If you're into naval history and the Age of Sail, you must have seen this. I can't imagine that you would not have seen Master and Commander. Then we got The Heart of the Sea. Now, I've got all these Moby Dick DVDs together with The Heart of the Sea because The Heart of the Sea revolves around an incident that happened to a boat called the Essex, which was rammed by a whale and sank, and the crew, some of the crew survived, some didn't, but there was a very arduous and traumatic story of survival, where some of them had to resort to cannibalism and so on. But that was a real event, that actually happened. But Herman Melville was aware of this story and partly based his story of Moby Dick on this particular episode, but others as well. There were other ships that were attacked by whales and so on, and there was the whole legend of white whales. White whales, not much was known about whales at the time that Moby Dick was written in the middle of the 19th century. But white whales tend to be, well, they don't tend to be, they are the older whales that have shed a lot of skin, and the sort of pale flesh underneath their outer skin begins to show through. So the white whales are the older, more mature, dominant kind of whales that often did. The whales are a really intelligent species, and they were aware of the hunters, the whalers, and they were aware of the whaling grounds, and they there's even kind of evidence to suggest that they understood the whaling ships were kind of driven by the wind, and that they could by getting the weather gauge, as it were, they could outmaneuver their hunters. But whales communicate through noises that they make in their skulls, which are almost like banging noises. And there's a theory that the reason the Essex was attacked by a whale was that there was a blacksmith working on hammering the harpoon heads at the time that the whale attacked, and the noise he was making hammering the harpoons was taken as being a kind of an aggressive, threatening noise by this whale that then literally kind of headbutted the ship and stove it in. Moby Dick. This one, another film starring Gregory Peck as Ahab. This particular film is just a work of art, really. If you haven't seen it, then I can highly recommend it. There were a couple of other TV versions made of Moby Dick. I've got 2 DVDs of the same production here, starring Patrick Stewart. The reason I've got 2 is that one of them, it's a very long DVD if you put all the episodes together, and this particular version tried to shorten it a little bit and put it, so cut certain scenes out, which is annoying in its own right, because I'd much rather have this longer version. But also trying to fit it all into one kind of chapter on the recording, as it were. This one separates out the different TV episodes, although it is all still on one disc. But this one, it goes wrong, so that you don't have the ending is all very you can't. It's unwatchable basically. The screen goes all pixelated and the sound goes, and then the DVD just stops without you seeing the famous ending. Whereas this one is complete and does contain parts that were cut out of this one. So that's the reason. I didn't realise that at the time. I would never have bought this had I known. But I had to then get this one to, to have the full satisfaction of watching it from beginning to end. This one is a slightly later TV version. It's got some highly skilled actors in it. Donald Sutherland, William Hurt as Ahab, Gillian Anderson as Ahab's wife. But it's not as good. The fact that Gillian Anderson has such a high presence in it is tells you from the start that she appears as Ahab's wife, who I can't remember. I have read Moby Dick a long time ago, but I don't remember Ahab's wife appearing in the book at all. Just gets a mention, whereas in this particular version, there's quite a lot of her, at home, and the sort of the effect of Ahab's obsession on their marriage and the family. So it's a different take on it altogether, and it's not, it's good, but it's not as good as the other two, and not as close to the book either. This is turning into a massively long DVD, a massively long video, for which I don't apologise. I enjoy waffling and rambling. Peter O'Toole in Lord Jim. This is based on Joseph Conrad book. Conrad wrote a lot of books set around the sea, particularly in the Far East, and it's really, really interesting story about the nature of courage and integrity, and honour and so on. Other than that, I won't talk much about it. This sort of slightly contradicts what I was saying earlier about how you don't get many good dramas or on TV any longer. This came out not that long ago on the BBC, and was I thought was highly commendable work, although I strongly suspect it's got the BBC logo on it, but I strongly suspect it was produced by a separate company. But now I have read the book, and I've read another book by the author. I can't remember his name, but he writes very kind of gritty, kind of true to life stories. They're very cynical. There's lots of inhumanity in them, the barbarity. Ian Maguire, there we go, the thrilling adaptation of Ian Maguire's award-winning novel, that was his name. Yeah, the stories are very kind of grim and, as I say, cynical and quite nasty, brutish sort of tales. The North Water is really about a shipload of a whaling ship full of very kind of rough characters, and the ship owner, his intention is to for the ship to get lost at sea. Basically, the captain has been paid to get it trapped in ice, and the arrangement is that an accompanying vessel will be in the vicinity and will be able to rescue them all, but the ship itself is going to be lost, and the ship owner will then be able to make money from the insurance, which is something that was very common in those days, for ship owners to deliberately send their ships on dangerous voyages in order for them to be lost, because they made more money that way. If the ship was old and decrepit, they made more money from the ship that way than they would ever do from its mercantile activity, whether it was chasing whales or carrying cargo. But yeah, it all goes horribly wrong. There are psychopathic killers on the ship, and the main character is a doctor who has been disgraced and is trying to make a living. So he has a sort of hidden past, and some of the ship's crew think that he has a jewel on him that he looted during the Indian Mutiny. So they're after that. All kinds of subplots and nastiness going on, but a really good, gritty story of the sea. And again, to kind of contradict my earlier statements about the lack of good drama on TV. So this is the first season of The Terror, which was based on the true events of Franklin's expedition to try and find the Northwest Passage. It's a kind of horror story, as the title might suggest. But, and it has some very unreal kind of events happening within this real story, because no one really knows what happened to Franklin's expedition. I mean, bodies have been found in the fairly recent past and so on, and remains of documents and so on that they left in various places, but the actual ending of the crew has never come to light. So it's the sort of story of that, but much of what goes on is unreal. There's like this sort of over the top polar bear that has this sort of malicious influence, haunts the crew, and the local native tribes and that have this sort of superstitious, add this sort of superstitious element to it. But the whole point, the reason I like this, and I didn't like the second series of The Terror so much, which was set in a not prisoner of war, but a Japanese internment camp in California during the Second World War. Didn't like that so much, but the reason I like this so much was that there's been a lot of conjecture that the crew of the crew of the Terror, that was the name of one of the ships, and I forget the name of the other, but they literally went mad through lead poisoning because of the way that their food. It was considered to be, revolutionary technology at the time, sort of canning food, but there was a little lead lining to the tins, and they all began to suffer from lead poisoning, which might have deranged them. So a lot of the things that happen in here and are presented as a sort of reality, it might have been the sort of thing that was going on in their minds rather than actually happening for real. But this terror that they have of this polar bear, it feels real if you put yourself in the place of someone who is suffering from a sort of mental derangement, from the lead poisoning. So I thought it was a really good series that I really enjoyed. Then I've got, back to the story of mutiny, I've got 3 films on the subject of the Bounty and the mutiny on the Bounty. So The Bounty was the most recent film, starring Anthony Hopkins and Mel Gibson. Anthony Hopkins is Captain Bligh, and Mel Gibson is, what was his name? I forget the other name of the other chap. They'll come to me in a minute. And then you've got two older films that were made of Mutiny on the Bounty. Trevor Howard as Bligh and Marlon Brando as, what was his name? Christian Fletcher, yeah. And the even earlier one, which was Clark Gable as Fletcher and Charles Lawton as Captain Bligh. All three of those, really good. I recommend them. Very interesting story. French Lieutenant's Woman is kind of, I've got it in my naval section. It's sort of got a naval theme, sort of hasn't, but it's there. Based on the book by John Fowles. Haven't watched it in a long time actually, but yeah, interesting film. And then I've got that documentary that I was going on about earlier. On battleships, which is reasonable, worth having. Nothing special about it though. And then finally, oh no, not finally. Excuse me. I've got an old BBC, I think it was, drama documentary. Yeah, it was BBC. On Shackleton. I think this dates back to the 1980s. Again, this is another thing about BBC documentaries, is that you don't get, documentaries, not documentaries, I keep saying documentaries, no, you don't get drama of this length anymore. I'm not talking any longer about the quality, but they have to compact their dramas down now to 6 episodes maybe. They can't indulge in these really long series any longer because the airtime is, they have to make the most profit from the airtime that they possibly can. I know the BBC aren't, for profit enterprise, but they still kind of compete in that marketplace. And the production costs have gone up so much as well, that these old BBC dramas that used to go on for about 12 weeks just aren't there any longer. War and Peace is a good example of that. The BBC, back in the 70s, the BBC made a series on War and Peace, dramatising War and Peace, and I think it was 26 episodes long. And the recent one they did, we're out of, I got the wrong. Yeah, the recent one they put on was only about 6 episodes, I think. They just haven't got the budget for it anymore. Finally, then we got The Perfect Storm with George Clooney. Very, very good film. Still in that naval theme, but not conflict. Just surviving, or not surviving, as the case may be. The sea's hostility, the environment. Right, okay. As this is going on quite a long time, I'm just going to cut now because I want to talk a little bit about books, and there's another kind of obsession I have really with the modern day and changes that are happening. Okay, so I won't spend very long down here because I mainly wanted to show you one particular book, and for the life of me I can't find it, and you can see how chaotic it is. I mean, I've got masses of books, and this is like the one part that I can get to. The rest is just the rest of my book collection is all behind junk, basically. But as it happens, most of my naval history books and stories of the sea and so on are kind of in this area here. And this part is fairly easy to get to because all I've got to do is move an armchair to get to this lot. But as I say, there was one particular book I wanted to bring to your attention, and I can't find it anywhere, so I must have put it somewhere other than my naval section, which is irritating. I should have prepared this better. But anyway, there's a couple of things that I just wanted to talk about down here. One is just in passing, really, that often had conversations with David at Zen Miniature Painting in the past about the choice of whether to have lots of books like I do or whether to rely on libraries. And I would always go for down this road, even chaotic as it may be. I've got it all here. I've this particular book, I'll talk about it in a moment, but ironically, I did get it from a Polish library. It was ex-library stock, and I've been searching for it for ages, and finally found a copy on, I think it was on eBay or something, that had been released from a library in Poland. And my whole point about libraries really is that you only can read things in libraries that are there on the shelves that are available or are available in another library that they can do some kind of transfer for. You're not going to get everything that is out there, and you're not necessarily going to, find what you're looking for, but also you're only going to have access to things that I hesitate to say they, but you know what I mean. You're only going to be able to read things that they want you to read. So things that suddenly become politically unacceptable or politically incorrect, all that kind of thing, will get taken off the shelves. It won't be there any longer. That's not to say that I approve or agree with some of the sentiments that were written 100 years ago or 200 years ago. I don't, but I still think they were important books in their day, possibly. So why not have them now? We're back onto this thing about how the world is changing and so on. But I think it's much better to have books in your own collection and make your own mind up about them, rather than rely on an authority of some kind to make the determination for you. And there are plenty of books down here that are completely uncontentious, but just disappear from libraries. Like, so for instance, right down the bottom here, I'm not going to. Well, you can see how these shelves are collapsing here. This one has collapsed, so it's putting pressure on all these other books. So it's impossible without a lot of effort to get some of these books out from underneath that pile. But there's a couple of books down there, Signal 250 and another one, forget its title, but they were kind of sold off by the library in Plymouth at the time that the library location moved into the town centre, and they just got rid of a lot of their books that weren't being taken out or weren't felt to be needed any longer. Really good book. The Signal 250 is a book about the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, in the Spanish-American War in 1898. I really value it as a source. It's a battle that I'm particularly interested in, and it's a really good book. But now it's not out there any longer. It's not published, it's not in bookshops, it's not on bookshelves of libraries. It's gone forever, you know, just like Langton miniatures have gone forever. You know, but I've got it. It's part of my past. You know, it's something that I sort of treasure, not highly, you know, but it's there. It's kind of part of me. This is my own personal library with books in it that mean something to me. You know, not something that is just presented to me as a kind of you know, a sort of selection of books that someone else thinks might be of interest to me. You know, I've built this up over decades, longer than that, you know. Well, not longer than decades, but, you know, many decades, 50 years of just hoarding books. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about how the way media and so on is changing, the world is changing, and not necessarily for the better, even though you might think the changes have improved modern day, you know, but doesn't necessarily work out that way. Is this book that I can't find dealt with one aspect of the history of a Russian Navy ship, which I should be able to get this particular one out without too much problem. So, way back, quite a few years now, I discovered the existence in the local cemetery of the graves of two Russian sailors who had died whilst their ship, the Askold, was in Plymouth in 1917. So I'll find, in this book here, I'll find a picture of the Askold. Yeah, this is probably going to be the best page. So, the Askold is a really interesting ship in its own right. This is a picture of it here. As you can see, it has 5 stacks or funnels, or whatever you want to call them, which was a kind of it almost makes it look like a sort of modern version would be a sort of pimped up car with lots of exhaust pipes or something like that. You know, it's 5 funnels indicates that it had a lot of boilers going and a lot of engines running, giving off a lot of smoke that had to be ejected. So it was extremely fast. So this was a real whippet of a cruiser. Never worked out that way because the ship was so badly handled and so badly maintained and so on that it rapidly deteriorated, and its sailing abilities, you know, just diminished very quickly. I think it was laid down in the late 19th century. I think it was laid down around 1898. Yeah, 1898. Laid down 1898. But it sort of went through the Russo-Japanese War, survived the Battle of the Yellow Sea, and then there is a massive story behind the ship. There was a mutiny on board it in shortly after the Russo-Japanese War, there were mutinies going on in the fleet during the Russo-Japanese War. Towards the end of it, that were part of what was known as the Russian Revolution of 1905, which was a precursor to the 1917 revolution. The captain of the ship was very lenient to his crew during that first insurrection or mutiny, and was disciplined by the Russian Admiralty and committed suicide as a result of the disgrace on board the ship. So it was becoming a very unhappy ship. As I say, it was very poorly maintained, very low morale, very poor conditions. During the First World War, it was moved from Vladivostok, took part in some of the sort of Allied naval operations in the Far East, but then sailed through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, took part in the Dardanelles campaign. So it was the only Russian ship there, and then was in such poor condition that it had been ordered back to St. Petersburg, I believe, but it had to stop off in Toulon for massive repairs. And this is there was another mutiny in Toulon in 1916 when I think there's 5 or 6 sailors were executed, and then it had to stop off again in Plymouth on its way back round into the Baltic, and it was here in March 1917 when the first sort of the revolution began, the sort of, not the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 or November in our calendar, but a more sort of moderate, when the Tsar was overthrown and abdicated in March 1917, and Kerensky's government eventually took place. But anyway, during that time, 2 sailors from the ship died, and they're buried in local cemetery in Plymouth. And I was sort of fascinated by their story, and did quite a lot of research into the Askold. Afterwards, by the way, it sailed round to the north of Russia, so the White Sea, into, I think it was in Murmansk, and that was at the time of the Civil War then, and this is to sort of end the story. But the captain of the ship was shot dead in the street because of his association with the execution of the mutineers in Toulon, and that mutiny was almost certainly a very kind of Bolshevik instigated uprising. And then eventually the ship was captured by most of the sailors went off to fight inland during the Civil War, and the ship itself was taken by the Royal Navy, was temporarily part of the Royal Navy. I think it went under the name of HMS Glory, or the 5th, I think. So there have been quite a few HMS Glories by that time. And then it was finally, I think it was either given back to the Russians, who scrapped it immediately, or the Russians decided they didn't want it back, and it was scrapped around 1921. Apologies for any background noise. My neighbours have decided to start drilling into the walls, as they occasionally do. Their house is probably like Swiss cheese by now. So apologies if you hear any noises. Yeah. So anyway, these two sailors died in Plymouth, and I really wanted to make a YouTube video about it. Now you would think, wouldn't you, that that social media, digitisation, access to outlets for people to make their own content is all good stuff. But I found it impossible really to make a worthwhile video of the story of these two men and so on, because so much of the imagery that you would have to put up, as the backdrop on the screen was content protected. And I find that really insidious. To give you a very good example, I discovered that some of the sailors from the Escald had actually been filmed, and the film had been put out in cinemas in Britain, and it was called it was part of a much larger film on the subject. I think it was called something like Our Allies in Salonika, because the Escald had actually, after the Dardanelles campaign, it had first gone to Salonika, or Thessalonica as it's known now, and it'd been part of that whole operation to try and invade the sort of Ottoman homelands, almost, as it were. And there was a disastrous campaign in Salonika. But anyway, it's beside the point. There was a very short snippet of film that included some of the sailors from the Escald, and I thought that is ideal material to put up on YouTube. But what happens with so much, especially with music, what happens is that people just mine all this old media, whether it's music or film or whatever, and then they digitize it, but they then copyright their digitized version. So that footage was available to me, but in order to put it up on my YouTube channel, I would have had to, I forget the name of the company, get it for, they're connected with, all these Reuters and all those kind of agencies, but in order to put it out on YouTube or broadcast it in any way, you had to pay a kind of fee, and the fee was a sort of a rental. So it only allowed you to put it out there for for 6 months, but they charged £900 just for the right to show it as part of your own content, and it was literally 30 seconds, if that, hardly any time at all, but absolutely pertinent to the story. Gave the story real. Sort of something to watch that was relevant, unlike a lot of these naval documentaries you see, where you get the same footage of the same ship being torpedoed, and it's presented as being the Battle of Jutland and the Battle of this and the Battle of that, and it's not. It was actually relevant material, but impossible to put out unless you paid an absolute fortune, which of course I couldn't afford to do. Same with a lot of copyrighted music. You can't put music from, you might have an old record that was made in the 1940s or 50s. You can't digitize that yourself and put it onto a YouTube video, because you can bet your bottom dollar someone has bought the copyright to that material and renewed it, as it were, even though it's long since past copyright protection ended on it. Someone has purchased the right and then is monetizing that copyright to make money from it. So digitization is actually closing down, you know, those outlets rather than permitting them. It's actually stopping access for, you know, for you, the public, to see that kind of thing, because no TV producer is ever going to make a documentary about this story, I'm sure, you know, given what we were saying earlier about production costs and all that sort of thing, and, you know, getting the required audience. You're only going to make documentaries on things that are going to get a much larger audience than the size of the audience that would be interested in this sort of very niche aspect of the Ascol's history. I mean, there's another example. I probably could have done it and got away with it, but there was a painting made while the ship was in Toulon, and a French artist made a painting of it, which you can find on the internet. I could have put that up as part of the backdrop to the story, but again, probably someone's got a copyright on that, so it'd probably be, you know, if it were noticed, it would be a copyright strike against it. So in the end, it was an absolutely fascinating story, but I decided not to do it. But one of the other things I discovered was that there was an officer on board the Ascol, and his name was Volodymyr Steyer. He he eventually became a Polish national. But I think he was born in America originally, possibly of Polish parents. But anyway, he was an officer in the Russian Navy, and he wrote a book on his time on the Ascol, which concentrated mainly on its time in the Dardanelles. But yeah, I guess that drilling again, sorry. But you know, I thought, wouldn't it be great to get hold of that book? And that was the book that I eventually found in a Polish library. And, you know, I have it in my collection. Really wish I could find it. It's in Polish, and I don't speak Polish, but I was slowly kind of going through on Google Translate and trying to get it translated. But, you know, now with AI having made such massive advances in, you know, in the technology, I think it would be a fairly simple matter to get AI to translate it for me, much more lucidly than my own sort of very kind of ponderous attempts to do it using Google Translate. Yeah, so it's there, and I'll get. But one of the things that I did find, you know, useful from this book that had never occurred to me before, was that the mutiny in Toulon, one of the complaints that the sailors had was that they weren't allowed off the ship, whereas the officers were given shore leave, and a lot of them went to Paris and had a fine time in Paris while the ship was being, you know, maintained, whereas the crew had to stay on board. The ship was in dreadful state. You know, the lower decks were, you know, underneath the waterline, were constantly flooded. They could even fish in the water, you know, that was there in the ship, actually in the ship. And their complaint was that they were being treated like criminals. But in fact, a lot of them were criminals, because when the ship had left Vladivostok, it had been undercrewed, and this Volodymyr Steyer, who wrote under the name, he wrote this book, it's called Lonely Cruiser, he wrote under the name of Bruno Zimich. What he actually said was that because it was undercrewed, they actually press-ganged a lot of criminals from the sort of Siberian end of the, you know, the penal colony system, and put them on board as the crew. So the ship was full of Bolshevik agitators, criminal, you know, press-ganged sailors. It was ripe for mutiny anyway. And one of the two, there were two sailors who died in Plymouth. One of them had been enlisted during that period, so in Vladivostok. So I'm pretty sure he was probably, possibly a criminal, and he had died. He was only about in his 20s when he died, and he died of, heart failure, exhaustion, the rest of it. And it would have been because he was a boiler. He would have been, working as a slave, essentially, stoking the boilers in dreadful, insanitary conditions. And it's no wonder that he died. He just happened to die in Plymouth, so there's a record of it here. And the other prisoner was a suicide. He died, and there's a local newspaper article about his death, and he committed suicide by drinking battery acid. Horrible way to die. It took him a long time to die, but he described his motivation for suicide to the doctor in the local Royal Naval Hospital as that he was the only Tsarist loyalist sailor on the ship, so he was ostracised by the rest of the crew, and he'd committed suicide when Tsar Nicholas abdicated, because he was so, despondent at his situation within this mutinous crew, and the fact that the emperor that he worshipped had been forced to abdicate. But yeah, really, really interesting story. But things change, possibly for the better. But in fact, often, what seems like a democratizing, open expression, enabling piece of change with YouTube and greater social media and interconnections doesn't necessarily always work out that it will have the effect that you want comes out at the end of it. And the story of the Askold was going to be lost forever in the next couple of 100 years, just as in the more immediate future Langton miniatures are going to be lost forever, and Warhammer Historical's rules are lost forever, and Diane Keaton will never see her like again. The world is changing, and as I say, I'm aging, and I understand a lot more now about why it changes, and why change has to happen. But there we are. Anyway, that's it. I'm going to stop waffling because this has been going on for ages. Thank you very much for watching, and watch out because in the near future I'll probably put a back rep up on my Age of Sail war game. Bye for now.